Okay, so this is the game class part 2. In the first video, we basically just kind of walked through the signature of the game class and the variables, the main method. Now we're down to the constructor. In the constructor, the job of the constructor is to initialize or set initial values to each of the instance variables. And so, when the game starts, we're going to set number of players to 0, and it'll be 0 until they click on the checkbox that determines the number of players. We set game over to false because, of course, the game is not over. We set all players to some new player array, square brackets, 6. So when I use new, the name of an object and then the square brackets, this is creating a new array. This 6 tells it the size of the array. The array is able to hold 6 players. The players don't exist yet, but this is creating the array in memory and assigning the address of that array to the all players variable, which was declared, of course, to hold an array of players. And then I go through a loop and fill up that array with players. So for int I equals 0, I less than 6, I plus plus, all players sub I equals some new player. And I've decided that it was easier for me if I allowed each player to know its own index number. So each player is going to have its own number. There's going to be a player 0, a player 1, a player 2, a player 3, a player 4, and a player 5. Now, I've decided that I'm just going to go ahead and create all 6 players, even if only 3 of them are playing. So this number of players variable is still set to 0, and I'm creating 6 players. You'll see later on in the code that even if I've created all those players, I don't necessarily have to use them. This .add mouse listener. Now we'll look at the player class in a minute, but I'm just going to glance at it for a second. In the player class, it implements mouse listener. If you implement the mouse listener interface, it's going to require that you implement some method, and then when you do, you can then register that class that has implemented mouse listener to listen for mouse events. So the game is a JFrame, and by extending JFrame, you inherit some methods. One of those methods is add mouse listener. And so then when this JFrame calls that method, add mouse listener, and passes in some object that implements the mouse listener interface, that object can now listen to mouse events. And so after I create the new instance of the player, I register that player as a mouse listener. So now whenever any mouse is clicked inside of the JFrame window, every player is going to see that mouse click. So the player has to implement mouse listener, and then it can be added as a mouse listener to the JFrame. I set the roll count to 0 because the dice haven't been rolled yet. I set whose turn to 0 because it's the very beginning of the game, and might as well make it somebody's turn. Let's make it player 0. This .set layout null. So here's where I add my buttons. And there's a thing called the layout manager. If I don't turn the layout manager off, it will try to locate all my widgets that I add to my game. But I don't want it to. Remember, I'm lazy. I'm not making my thing resizable. So the layout manager is used when you have a resizable application. It'll move your widgets around for you as the application is resized. But layout managers are a little tricky, so I just make it fixed size and then I set everything exactly where I want and it doesn't move. So this .set layout is a method inherited from JFrame. Null means nothing. Okay, it's an address to nothing. And so when you call the set layout method and pass it an address to nothing, it's basically turning off the layout manager. By default, there is one, and I'm turning it off. Now I create a new button, and inside I pass it a string literal with the letters roll, and this is the text that appears on the button, roll. and I store that in my roll button variable. And then I add action listener. Okay, remember up top, we implemented the action listener interface. That interface requires that we write a method. And then we add this. This refers to the instance of the game. So when you are in a class and you use the keyword this, it's referring to the instance of the class. Now you can only use the keyword this when you're not in a static context. Okay, what does it mean by a static context? If I'm inside of main, I'm in a static context. Remember, main, because it's static, belongs to the class, not an instance of the class. I don't have to have an instance of the class to call main. The constructor creates an instance of the class, so now I've got an instance. I'm not in a static context. I have an instance. I can then use the keyword this to refer to that instance of the class. And so what this does is this registers the instance of the class, the game, as the action listener of the roll button. Okay, so now when the roll button is clicked, that method that the interface required us to write will get called. And so the game is now listening for clicks on the roll button. And we set the roll button to be disabled at the beginning. Remember, at the very beginning, they had to click a box to tell us how many players, and we couldn't roll the dice until they select how many players. So this is what disables the button. It's visible on the screen, you just can't click it. Nothing happens when you click it. This.add roll button. So this is the instance of the game, add.roll button. So remember, this thing is a JFrame. JFrames inherit, or because we extend JFrame, we inherit the add method of the JFrame, and you can pass in any kind of widgets, buttons and checkboxes and things of that sort. And by adding them to the JFrame, that makes them visible on the screen. So we create the instance, we add the JFrame as the action listener, we set enabled to false on the button, and then we add the button to our JFrame as something that's going to be visible on the screen. And then roll button, we set bounds. This will be the X location, the Y location, the width, and the height of our button. Background, new background. So we create a new instance of the background image. We create an array of dice. We go through a for loop and create instances of those dice. So new dice. Each dice is going to have an X and a Y value because the dice are not all in the same location, and this is the way I decided, instead of saying set bounds, I decided to give each die X, Y location so the die knows where it's supposed to be on the screen, and then when I tell it to draw itself, it'll draw itself in the appropriate spot. And I stick them in the array. And then we add mouse listener to my dice. So just like the player implements mouse listener and is going to listen for mouse clicks, the dice also implements mouse listener and is going to listen to mouse clicks. So each time we click on the screen, every player and every dice is going to hear it. It's got an event that will be, or a method that will be called when that click takes place. Since each die knows its location on the screen, it's basically going to just check to see if it's been clicked. And if it has, it'll change itself to being selected or not. It's going to toggle it from being selected to not selected. That way we can click on dice to select them. And then the player, they're going to need to know if it's their turn. And if it is, then when they're clicking, they're going to place the score in some location. And so every player and every dice needs to listen for mouse clicks. That's just the way I decided to implement it. The checkboxes. Now, I'm only creating 6 checkboxes. They're going to be numbered 1 through 7. Now I create an array of size 7 because I'm going to leave the 0 spot empty. I decided it was convenient for me to have my checkboxes at indexes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And so instead of starting I out at 0, I decided to start it out at 1. And so the checkbox at index 1 is, if they click on that checkbox, it'll mean 1 player. And there is no checkbox for 0 players. So I left the spot in index 0 empty. And so we got our loop, I equals 1, I less than 7, I plus plus. Select player sub I is equal to some new checkbox. And this first parameter for a checkbox tells it the piece of text that will be adjacent to the text box. And since I is a number, I would like that number to be converted to a piece of text as the label for that checkbox. So for the checkbox that means 1 player, I'd like the number 1 to be next to it, and the one that's for 3 players, I'd like a 3 to be next to it. So this is the label that goes on next to it. Now, if you use the plus operator, if it's got numbers on both sides of it, it evaluates to a number. But if either thing, either the left or right operand, is a string, it will convert the other operand to a string and then concatenate or put them both together. So what I'm doing here is I have an empty string. It's just a double quotes. It's an empty string literal. There are no characters in it. And I'm adding that to the integer I as a way of converting that I from an integer to a string. So this does a conversion. It converts the number to a piece of text and then passes that piece of text to the constructor of the checkbox. The other parameter is whether or not that checkbox is selected when it first starts. Does it have a checkbox in it or a check in it initially? And I pass a false, saying I don't want a check in this checkbox by default. So we start out without any checks in any of the boxes. Then we set its bounds, we set its location on the screen, the X, Y location, the width, and the height. And I want them evenly spaced down from each other, so this is just a little calculation of mine. I want it down below the roll button, so I get the Y value of the roll button, and then I add a little bit of space to it, and then I multiply it by I. So as I increases, each new checkbox is going to be down 25 pixels from the previous one. And since they're 20 pixels tall, that'll give me a little bit of a space, about 5 pixels in between each checkbox. And then we add item listener this. So we implemented the action listener for the button, and we implement the item listener for the checkboxes. And so now the J-frame is then going to be the item listener for all 6 checkboxes. So if any one of those 6 checkboxes is checked, then the method that I had to implement when I implemented the item listener interface, that method will get called. And so that method gets called when any of the checkboxes are clicked. And then this add select player sub I, that's adding the checkbox to the J-frame, putting it on the screen. So that's the constructor, and I'll go on in part 3, I guess, explain more of the game code.